We have officially hit 1 o'clock Eastern, so we are going to get started. I would like to welcome everybody to Drisha's Fall Programming and the second part of a series on the origins of academic Jewish studies by Dr. Chanan Gafni. As you may remember from last week, Dr. Gafni studied at Mir Yeshiva in Jerusalem while earning his academic degrees from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and Harvard University. He currently teaches at Hebrew University and Ben Gurion University. His publications include The Mishnah's Plain Sense in 2011, and most recently, Conceptions of the Oral Law in Modern Jewish Scholarship from 2019. Like I said earlier, we encourage you to please ask questions, unmute yourself, turn on your video, put questions in the chat or in Zoom or Facebook, and we value your active participation. Without further ado, Dr. Gafni.
Okay, thank you so much. What I thought we were going to do today is, before we continue with new stuff, I'll just do a very brief review what we've done in the previous session, and then immediately we'll advance further. So I'm sharing my screen with you. A second. The theme, the title of this course is about the origin of modern Jewish studies. And what we've done in the part 1 session, we mainly spoke about the definition. What is modern Jewish studies? We defined it. We said that it's called usually Wissenschaft des Judentums, or in Hebrew, Khohmat Yisrael, or in English, the science of Judaism. We said that it refers mainly to 19th century academic studies of Judaism, of different fields of Judaism, mainly in German-speaking lands and mainly in Germany, but also in other places as well. And what we were doing mainly last week, we were trying to focus on understanding what's so special about modern Jewish studies in the 19th century in Germany. And we said that there are two important features or two important things that make this such an important phenomenon. The first thing we said, it's for the first time, people approach Jewish studies in a critical manner, in an academic manner, rather than a traditional way of thinking about it. And most of the previous session was devoted to trying to define what are the differences between traditional and critical ways of studying Judaism. That was the main theme we spoke, but we said that there's also something in addition to that that makes Wissenschaft des Judentums, or Khohmat Yisrael, something important and special, and that's the fact that it has a very specific and particular historical and ideological context. Modern scholars in the 19th century were not just critical scholars, but they were also very much invested in preaching and pushing for different agendas, religious agendas, whether more or less liberal. What we ended up emphasizing, that it might sound a bit confusing, how can critical scholars who are supposed to be objective, if that exists, how could they at the same time be so involved in their ideological missions and goals? And we said that, as a matter of fact, these two things did go together hand in hand. And the reason was because critical scholarship emphasized in many ways that Jewish studies is something much more dynamic, something much more flexible in many ways, more pluralistic than people try to think about it. Judaism has a very big, has an external context, and all these things are not just something that scholars need to take into account, but also rabbis. When they try to think about the future of Judaism, they can take that into account. So that's what we've done in the previous session. What are we going to do today? Two things. So the first thing we're going to talk about, the main thing I would say we're going to talk about is the framework, meaning how did Jews get into this whole business of Jewish studies? In what format, in what places, what institutions were they able to study this, or be involved in their research, and also a little bit about their publications. And finally, at the end, we'll talk something about the way that this movement or phenomena was discussed in later scholarship. Is this something that was seen as something instructive or perhaps destructive? So these are the goals for today, mainly 4 and 5, the framework, inspiration, institutions, and publications, and finally, in retrospect, instructive or destructive. Those are the themes we're going to talk about today. As I said, starting from next week, we're going to talk not about the theories, not about the historical context, but rather approach the scholarship itself and try to see through the scholarship itself how people were advancing Jewish studies in the 19th century. So we're starting now with the fourth unit, fourth section, And we're going to talk about inspiration, institution, and publications. So these are the questions that we're going to be interested in today. Question number one that involves the inspiration. How did Jews ever get exposed to academic modes of thinking? Jews went to yeshiva. They didn't go, they studied in shuls or in their own communities. How did they ever get exposed to academic modes of thinking? When did that happen? How did that happen? So that's the first part. That's the blue part that you see. Inspiration will always be blue on your screens. Then we're going to talk about the ways that Jews were able, or where, or how were Jews able to exhibit their academic skills. Once they became involved in this academic world, where were they able to practice and exhibit their ideas or their skills? And finally, we'll talk about the circulation of these academic studies. How did Jews circulate their academic insights or achievements, especially due to the fact that we will see that they were not really part of the academic world, the official academic world of the time. So how did they manage to communicate? So these are the questions we're going to focus in this first part of the lecture. And we're going to start again with the inspiration. So let's say a few words about universities. Does anybody know what the word university comes from? So the university is actually part of a bigger title, and it basically means, it's a Latin word, but it means the community of teachers and scholars. That's the official word. The universitas is the community, and then it had a continuation about teachers and of scholars. And when were the first universities? And for a second, yes, I see somebody's commenting here or adding. I saw something on the chat. Okay, we'll talk about this in a second. We'll approach your comment in a second. So where did universities emerge to begin with? What were the first universities? Ignore the slide for a second.
In Europe, in France, in Italy, in England.
That's what I thought you would say. That's what the slide says. However, if you open some encyclopedias or Wikipedias and all those, you will see that some people will claim that the universities emerged actually in ancient Greece, 4th century BCE. But these are really different types of universities. They're not anything similar to the current universities that we're familiar with. And that's why, Charlene, you're right, that the universities that somewhat resemble what we think of universities emerged 12th century, more or less, on European lands. France, Italy, Germany, those were the first places where there were universities. I think I'm trying to remember which university is this. This is Heidelberg, I think. This is Heidelberg University. It's this is a 12th or 13th century illustration of Heidelberg University in Germany. It doesn't look exactly like a current classroom today, but you can get a sense what it could have looked like. So modern European universities emerged in the 12th century, but Jews were not part of this whole scene. Jews did not usually enter European universities until 17th, 18th centuries. Why? Any ideas?
They were in ghettos.
They were in ghettos, but even when they were able to leave their ghettos every now and then, why would they not enter universities?
Because it was alien subject matter to them.
Right. Universities were very Christian in their nature, and Jews probably didn't feel so much as part of that world. Besides which, most professions that were studied at universities were not open for Jews to begin with. So why would they enter universities? There was one field that some Jews did study in universities every now and then, medicine, right? Medicine was a kosher field that even Jews, Jewish mothers wanted their sons to be doctors already back then, maybe. So, so there were people who studied medicine, but very few. More, it starts in Italy, and only later on also in other European countries. So those were the first Jews that enter universities, but we're talking about very, very few exceptions. Nevertheless, there are few individuals that did get exposed to the academic world in all sorts of ways, whether reading stuff or meeting some professors, and at times even had close interactions with known Christian scholars. So this is the very, very beginning or early encounter of Jews with the academic world, not a very impressive start. Okay, now we're gonna move to the next slide. And we will see that only under the influence of the surrounding European culture, and we're mainly speaking about end of the 18th and early 19th centuries, So under the influence of the surrounding European culture in general, and also an attempt to be accepted to gymnasiums and universities, a dramatic revolution in the Jewish educational system takes place, and that starts in the late 18th century and early 19th century. So this is already something much more broad. We're not talking about individuals, we're talking about a much greater phenomena, greater revolution. Secular studies are introduced in various Jewish schools, and also modern Jewish schools were founded throughout Europe. In some of these schools, Jews and Christians study together. That's a very interesting phenomena, but that's not as common. But certainly many Jewish schools will allow secular studies. And this is, again, the beginning of exposing Jews to something that is different than the Mishnah and Talmud or Bible, something more broad. And it's not just what you study, it's also how you study certain things. By the turn of the 19th century, large numbers of Jewish students, earned academic degrees in German universities and also in other universities throughout Europe, but mainly I would say Italy and Germany are the places where Jews are are more visible than in other places. In some universities, by the end of the 19th century, for sure, Jews could be a very high percentage of the students in general. Here I have a few pictures. This is for us because we can't read so much. It's certainly not for me at this hour at night, so I include some pictures. And so these are a few. Does anybody know who this guy is? Hint, we saw him last week, but you don't have to remember these people. I'm not going to test you on this. Does anybody know who this guy is?
Not my face.
All the Jewish maskilim, enlightened Jews, look a little bit alike, but this is somebody a little bit famous. And I'll give you another hint.
I don't know.
That's Wesley.
Oh.
Right, this is Wesley. Excellent.
Yeah.
So
well,
this is
Naftali.
Naftali.
That was his big.
So let's say a few words about him. Naftali Herz Wesley was a good friend, close friend of Moses Mendelssohn. He lived in Denmark and then in Germany for most of his life. And he's especially known for the book that you see on the left-hand side called Divrei Shalom Ve'emet. Did anybody hear about this book? Very famous book. When you study, at least I know in Israel, when we studied about the Haskalah or the Enlightenment or the Jewish Enlightenment, so we mentioned Mendelssohn, Moses Mendelssohn, and Naftali Herz Wesley. So these are the main two figures. And he's most famous for this book called in Hebrew, Divrei Shalom Ve'emet. What is unique? Did anybody hear about this book? Whatever you can tell us is much more interesting than what I just, when I just speak. This is a very famous book, appeared in the 1780s. And in this book, what Naftali Herz Wesley was preaching for is to include secular studies in the Jewish educational system. Yep. So not just study Torah all day long, but also include other fields of knowledge, geography, science, and biology, and all sorts of other fields. And he even claimed that not every Jew is supposed to become a rabbi. What a big revolution, right? Before then, everybody wanted to become part of the rabbinical world. And he says, no, some people are not meant for that. But everybody needs to have some exposure to general knowledge so people don't feel that he doesn't belong in modern Europe. And in addition, he also said that the way you study, even Jewish studies, should be I would say, more critical than people usually did. You see who he devotes this book to? Can you read the Hebrew? He says, I'm reading it for you. You can understand even from the way I read the Hebrew. You don't have to know how to read Hebrew or the Rashi script. He says, Divrei Shalom Ve'emet lekehal adat Israel, for the nation of Israel, for the community of Israel, hagarim, that live be'artzot memshelet hakeisar hagadol. It's meant for the Jews who live in the countries under the control of the great Caesar, ha'ohev et bnei Adam u'mesameach et habriot. So under the Caesar, who loves all people. Josephus Hasheni. Who was Josephus Hasheni? He was the Austrian leader in the late part of the 18th century. And he was also preaching and hoping for Jews to become full members of the European community. And he felt that this book would probably emerge people to be more involved in and broaden their horizons. What do you think people thought about this book, and what did people think about the author? Was this book accepted in favor by everybody? Were people happy with this publication? I think you can guess if I'm asking.
I can assume no.
No, the book was burned, and also the author was almost burned for having these crazy ideas. So this book was not really accepted. Rabbi Moses Sofer, Chatam Sofer, was very anti this book, but nevertheless, it's like an important mark when we talk about Jewish educational system. So this is the Western world revolution in the educational system. If we turn to Eastern Europe, this is not the theme of our course because we're mainly focusing in Western Europe, or Central Europe. But in Eastern Europe, there's also a similar book that was published a few years later by this also Jewish maskil, enlightened Jew. His name was Yitzchak Ber Levinson, and he wrote a book called Teuda B'Yisrael. We're not going to get into all the details of this book, but that was more or less the equivalent of Naftali Herz Vesely's book in Germany. So two books are preaching for major changes in Jewish curriculum, for including more secular studies. So that's one way we see that some things are starting to change. However, it was not just these people who are publishing books and are preaching for to broaden Jewish studies and to include other fields as well, but it was also, as I said, modern institutions that are emerging and that appear all over Europe. So it's not just books or journals that preach for changes, but also actual institutions throughout Europe.
I want to
talk about, yes.
What language were those written in?
So both of these books were written in Hebrew.
In Hebrew.
But there were books in German as well.
Okay.
There are similar words. There was another Jewish maskil whose name was Herz Homberg, very radical Jewish maskil, and he wrote similar ideas in German. So it's not just in Hebrew. But you have to take into, it's a good question, it's a good point you're saying.
Well, and was it radical to be using Hebrew then for a sort of somewhat secular purpose?
You have to think, what are alternatives that these people have? Most Jews did not read German, certainly not in German characters. So it was either this or Yiddish.
Yeah.
But more official texts, books that were meant for serious purposes, not something popular, was often put in Hebrew. He's not trying to convince people who know German to be involved in secular studies because they probably already are involved in secular studies. So those people are, behind. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the institutions. And here I want to tell you, we're going to talk about the story of one institution, which I find a fascinating story. And it's going to become important later on in our survey as well. This is one school called Der Samson Schule in Wolfenbüttel. Did anybody visit these communities in Germany ever? I didn't. You don't have to feel bad. But it's a small town in Germany. It's actually known for various reasons because there's a famous library there. But there was also a Jewish traditional school founded by the Samsons family. That's why it was called Der Samson Schule, the school of the Samsons. And it was a traditional school, almost like a yeshiva, mainly meant for orphans, people who had nobody who supports them. It was in lousy shape, only traditional studies, nothing modern in this institution. And this is one nice example, one fascinating example how schools change. Until the end of the 18th century, this was, as I said, a traditional school. But as time goes by, certain Jewish maskilim, enlightened Jews, realized that they want to make changes in schools. And instead of establishing new schools, what they would often do is they would take an existing school and try to modernize it, make it more modern. This is the story of this school. This school existed almost for 120 years or even more, like up into the 20th century. So it was founded in the late 18th century and existed for many years. It became a Jewish Christian school. So it's not just for Jews in the course of time, but even Christians were allowed to enter that school. And the reason this school is so interesting and it has such an interesting story because two of the most famous, or I would say two of the founders of Wissenschaft des Judentums, of modern Jewish studies, studied in that school. They start their trip or their journey as orphans, poor conditions. They know nothing about academic world, nothing about that. And through their experiences in that school, and as the school is changing in the course of their years there, they're also becoming more modern, exposed to different cultural atmosphere. So this is the school. The school was called Wolfenbüttel. Here you see a small guide book that was put in the end of the 18th century, rules for the students in that school. And the reason this school became so famous, as I said, is because the people who studied there, two of the students that studied there became the founders of modern Jewish studies. And the most famous one is Leopold Zunz. Did anybody hear this name, Leopold Zunz? There's some names you must remember at the end of this class. I'll give you, when I say that, you need to write it down. So Leopold Zunz, many people would say he's the founder of modern Jewish studies. He studied in that school. Okay, good. So I'll test you at the end of class. So Leopold Zunz is the founder, and we're very lucky that Leopold Zunz, this guy, in Hebrew was called Yom Tov Lippmann, and in German Leopold. We're very lucky because this guy had an obsession. He collected everything he found throughout his life. I mean everything. Every piece of paper, every document. You know, these people who make you crazy that they can't throw anything. So that was his personality. But thanks to Leopold Zunz, we know everything about his own family, about his childhood, and also the story of his school. He also wrote some memories, and I'd say almost an autobiography, where he talks about his experiences in that school. This is him when he's much older. This is not what he looked like as an orphan in the Samsons Schule in Wolfenbüttel. And here you see a piece of paper where he also records the name, the entire list of his family. You see his name. He wrote this much later, but here you see his family tree. These kind of stuff where he left just by thousands. A few years ago, I think Princeton University purchased the entire collection. It was very unfortunate because they took it from the National Library in Israel and transferred it to the States. But before that was done, I managed to go through these archives when people were not really familiar with a lot of the stuff there. And it's just a fascinating collection. And you get a very good sense what these people were like and what a dramatic change they went through in the course of their short or not so short lifetime. So Leopold Zunz went to that school, and when he leaves this traditional school that became modern, he already will become almost halfway through becoming a scholar. Another colleague or a friend of his in the same school was Isaac Marcus Yost. Did anybody hear that name? Also a very important Jewish scholar, also one of the founders of Wissenschaft des Judentums. He was the most famous historian. He was the first person who wrote a modern Jewish history in the 19th century, or you could say in many ways, the first person who wrote a modern historiography of the Jews. So this is Leopold Zunz, you see here. Here, this is just one paragraph from his memoirs. This was written in German. I have it here written in Hebrew, and I'll translate it for you, just so you get a sense. It's just touching when you read his experiences. This is how he talks about the way he entered that school before it was changed. And he says as follows, I'll translate simultaneously. He says, כל הרכוש שלי הסתכם באותה עת במעיל שק ישן לצד פרטי לבוש בודדים. When I came into the school, I had barely what to wear. I had just a few items that I was able to wear. בשנת 1805, in the year 1805, הגעתי להזנחה. I was that neglected. עד שלא ניטרו לי מכנסיים, פשוטו כמשמעו. My pants had more holes than pants. Basically, it was almost without anything. וגם לא גרביים, I didn't have socks. Just imagine these people. This is one of the most brilliant, important scholars of the 19th century. This is his memories, his memories from his childhood in school. And then he says, אני משער שבסוף 1806 או בתחילת 1807, I think that at the end of 1806 or beginning of 1807, הגיע המפקח ארנברג. So then the new inspector came to that school, and that's when the revolution changes. That's when the revolution starts in that school. קיבלנו חבילת בגדים, we finally got a new set of clothes. כשלבשתי שוב גרב שלמה, when I finally wore a new sock, וזוג מכנסיים שלמות, a new pair of pants, חשתי כמו אדם שנטרפה ספינתו בים, ועתה הגיע לחוף מבטחים. I felt as if I was a person whose ship was sinking in the sea, and finally we reached the shore. So these are just in a few words how he felt and these are his earlier years in school. Leopold Zunz, as I said, becomes one of the most important scholars. And this leads us to the next part of our discussion. So we spoke a little bit briefly about the way that Jews are getting exposed to secular studies, again, through modern Jewish educational institutions and attempts to include other fields in their studies. However, this is not the end of the story, it's just the beginning. Because, however, as Jews were still not able to receive practices, or I'm sorry, academic positions in Germany until 1870. What happens in 1870? Germany, 1870.
Germany unified.
Right, that's when Germany becomes unified, and only then Jews become emancipated. Very, very late. So for almost 100 years, Jews or I would say less than 180 years, Jews were very dominant in the universities as students, but they can just not get a position at any university. Furthermore, Judaism as a field of study was not so Judaism was not a separate field of study until the 20th century. Only in the 1920s, people start introducing Jewish studies in the academic world. It's crazy when you think about it. Today,
I have a question.
Yes.
If we look at Moses Mendelssohn, what was one of his big achievements? It was translating the Bible or the Torah into German.
Right.
So many Jews didn't know Hebrew anymore. Now that was early in the 19th century or late in the 18th.
This was late in the 18th century.
Yes, it was very early. That German Jews, many had already moved away from the traditional learning, but they were educated in the local language, the German.
Yeah.
For reading, at least. So this
nevertheless,
was earlier than before that kind of acceptance got into to take a leading position in a university, teaching or something.
I think that's why it's such a striking thing that it takes such a long period. When Jews are already becoming familiar with German in the end of the 18th century, becoming very dominant in the universities in the 19th century, but it's still so frustrating for them that they cannot get full positions in any universities until the end of the 19th century, and they can't teach Jewish studies on its own, for not just as an introduction to the to Christianity, but talk about Jewish studies as a field of study until the 20th century.
Yes.
So,
but they also, if they were being trained in the secular universities, they would have difficulty. They couldn't teach in the Jewish schools, the traditional Jewish schools.
So more and more Jews were already abandoning traditional Jewish elementary schools and going to gymnasia. But nevertheless, I'm saying when they enter universities, they could be brilliant students, but they can't learn or teach Jewish studies, even if they're familiar with this field and they have some academical or critical insights in those fields, in Bible, biblical studies, or rabbinic literature, but they can't really show anybody or exhibit their talents in any way. So under those circumstances, unfortunate circumstances, what we see is that Jews will, under such poor conditions and circumstances, how can Jews practice their critical skills or exhibit their critical skills in the realm of Judaism? So two solutions we can talk about. Some Jews just decide or choose. Some Jews chose to convert. We know of many, many Jewish professors who just converted to Christianity in order to get a position at universities. One famous guy was Eduard Ganz. Every name I tell you, if you would ever, I'm recommending that you will become professionals in this period of Jewish history and you will learn more about these people. So remember these names. Eduard Ganz was a very important law professor, and he was very involved in Jewish studies in his earlier years, but he converts in the 1850s, I think, maybe late 40s, to get a position at some German university because he just knew he will never be able to become a real academic scholar unless he takes that step. So this is one solution that some people do, but we're more interested in what other people decide, and that is to exhibit their skills in designated private Jewish organizations or in rabbinical seminaries throughout Europe, mainly in Germany, but also in other lands. In Italy, we know, and later on also in Budapest, in Warsaw. If you've ever traveled to any of these places, so you will always see that there's an ancient building of the Rabbinical Seminary in each one of these towns. So let's talk briefly about these two things, about some of these organizations and also a little bit about the Rabbinical Seminaries where Jews were able to advance their Jewish studies. So we're starting with something that I would call more like something like private organizations or institutions. So the first place that we need to mention here is the Verein für Kultur und Wissen der Juden. Anybody speaks German here? I'm sure one of you knows German better than me.
No.
No. Okay, so
I
you'll
had
know.
one
You'll.
year of it many years ago, like
Okay.
65.
Yeah, I'm unfortunately my German is becoming rusty too. But so you'll recognize some of these words. Juden, you know. Kultur, you know, right? So these are words you can recognize. The Verein is the institution
The union.
or right union.
The union.
Right, Union for Culture and Wissen and Science of the Jews. So this is, in a sense, the earliest institution in which Jewish studies become part of the scene, I would say. This is an institution that was established in the 1820s. By whom? You want to guess? Now you already know this name.
Zunz?
By Zunz, by Leopold Zunz. And how do we know everything about that institution? The institution only
He must
existed
have written everything down and saved it.
because he was the guy responsible for the archive. Great. So he took charge of the archive of that place. For 5 years it existed. It has this big name. There are like 20 people that were part of that great institution, or maybe it had two branches, one in Berlin and one in Hamburg. The main one was in Berlin. Altogether, we're talking about 20 people at each one of these two institutions. So it's not really dramatic in its size, but nevertheless, this is the first time where Jews are studying Jewish studies in an academic setting for the first time. And the goal of this Verein, of this organization, was not just to do Jewish research, but also to spread Jewish studies in other institutions as well, to get Jews exposed to critical thinking about their religion. Here you see two things that are related to this Verein. The first thing here you see is a document. This is the membership certificate of one of the people who participated in this institution, and you can guess that this is Leopold Zunz's own certificate. You can find his name somewhere there. I can't see it now. Yeah, you see it on the top somewhere. It mentions his name. So this is Leopold Zunz. This I took from the archive in the National Library when nobody was seeing. I photocopied it and I returned it. I promise I returned it. It's a very valuable document, the original certificate. And on the other side, you see here a journal that they put out. It's called Zeitschrift für die Wissenschaft des Judentums, meaning Zeit is time. Zeitschrift is a newspaper or periodical designated for the Wissenschaft des Judentums, for the science of Judaism. The first academic journal that is devoted to Jewish studies. You should be impressed. It's an important landmark. In addition to that, Leopold Zunz in this institution puts a very famous paper called Etwas über rabbinische Literatur, or Remarks on Rabbinic Literature, a very famous essay where he gives a sense what he feels needs to be done in the realm of Jewish studies. And he gives us a sense. He says, people know the Bible very well, but Jews have more to offer than just study the Bible. We know more than anybody else our post-biblical tradition. And we should approach those texts also in a critical manner, not in a traditional way, the way people read it before. And I want to read with you one paragraph of that book. You will read it, actually. I need somebody to volunteer and read this in English for us. It's a translation from the German. It's a very, very famous text. People talk about the Verein für Wissen und Kultur der Juden as the founding institution. So this is, I would say, the most important piece of work, scholarly work, that opens the gate for modern Jewish studies later on. And in the course of that paper, he says the following words. Who wants to read this for us? English. This is your mother tongue language, not mine. Who wants to read it? Sarah, you will have to do it if nobody volunteers. Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
Precisely.
Precisely because Jews in our times, limiting our attention to the Jews of Germany, are seizing upon German language and German learning with such earnestness and are thus, perhaps unwittingly, carrying the Neo-Hebraic literature to its grave, science steps in, demanding an account of what has already been sealed away. Now, when no new significant development is likely to disturb our survey, when we have access to tools greater than those available to scholars of the 16th and 17th centuries, when a higher culture permits a more illuminating treatment, when Hebrew books are more readily available than they will likely be in 1919, now, so we think, the development of our science in a grand style is a duty, one whose weight increases because of the fact.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Because of the fact
that the complex problem of the fate of the Jews may derive a solution, if only in part, from this science.
What impression do you get when you read this text? What's his inspiration for doing Jewish studies here? What do you feel when you read this? This text has been discussed by so many scholars. What do you feel? What's his main motivation? What inspires him to do this Jewish studies?
He thinks it's going to disappear. He wants to catalog like everything else in his life.
Right. It's crazy when this is what he thinks. If we would tell him that there's a Drisha program in the year, not 1919, but 2019 or 2020, he would just not believe it. He felt Jewish studies or Judaism is going to become, culturally assimilated. There will be no more Jews, no more Jewish books available in 100 years. Of course, he didn't think what else would happen in the course of the 20th century, but he thought that we need to, put in some surveys or accounts on what we have before everything disappears. So this is Leopold Zuns. We'll get back to this piece in the end of today's class. So this is one type of institution where people start doing this modern Jewish studies. But as I mentioned, it's not just this institution, it's mainly done in rabbinical seminaries.
He wrote
what are these rabbinical...
year after Heinrich Getz was born.
What? What year was?
1 year after Heinrich Getz was born.
Right. Heinrich Getz is a very crucial figure in our story. You're absolutely right. Although he was born a little bit more in the eastern part of Germany, but he is certainly part of this story. Maybe we'll mention him in a few minutes, okay? We'll mention him in a few minutes. So we spoke about the Verein, and now we're going to talk about rabbinical seminaries. What are these rabbinical seminaries? Jews are not able to become professors at universities. They can't teach Jewish studies anywhere. But the only solution that they're allowed to, they can't open their own universities, but they are allowed to provide rabbinical trainings for people who want to be ordained as rabbis. And what Jews are going to do, they're going to establish seminaries where they officially just give a professional, they ordain rabbis to become professional rabbis, but at the same time, they can give some background or teach Judaism in a critical manner. So basically what they would have been doing in universities, they're going to do in those seminaries. So here I collected for you from the web a bunch of, from the books, the seals of in all sorts of books. And these are just 3 important seminaries in Germany. One of them, the ones that you see here on the left-hand side, is from where? You see? Where was that first seminary? This is the earliest seminary, the Rabbinical Seminary in Germany. And what place is it from?
Berlin.
Can you read?
Breslau.
In Breslau.
Breslau? Yeah.
Breslau.
Oh my God, look at that.
And who was, David, you mentioned Heinrich Getz. Heinrich Getz was a professor at that institution. So Breslau was the first Jewish rabbinical seminary that appears in Germany. These are from the same institution. If you know the JTS in New York, it's somewhat a continuation of that institution. And the rabbi that was the head of that school was Zecharias Frenkel. We mentioned him last week. He was the founder of the conservative movement, what became the conservative movement. He's the head of this seminary. It was very upsetting for Abraham Geiger. If you remember, Abraham Geiger was the founder of Reform or Liberal Judaism. He was the chief rabbi in the city of Breslau. And when they opened this rabbinical seminary, he was assuming that who would be the head of the school? Of course, it should be the local rabbi, but he was not chosen as the head of this institution. And then later on, he decides to open a new institution that will be more liberal in Berlin. This is called the institution, here, this one, the Hochschule, the High School for Wissenschaft des Judentums in Berlin. So this is the academic institution where he was teaching Jewish studies in Berlin. So we have already one institution that is associated with the conservative movement, one with more liberal streams in Judaism. So what's missing?
Modern Orthodoxy.
Orthodoxy, right? Modern Orthodoxy. And this is indeed the third institution. You see in the middle, you see Rabbinical Seminaries, Berlin. That was the Rabbinical Seminary where David Zvi Hoffman, if you heard of him, where he was teaching. So we basically have 3 rabbinical seminaries just in Germany, and many other institutions of the same kind throughout Europe. As a matter of fact, the first institution was in Padua in Italy in the 1820s already, but then in the 1850s and onwards, every Jewish camp will have their own institution where they teach Jewish studies the way they believe it should be done. So obviously liberal schools will be more liberal the way they teach it, and more traditional institutions will be more conservative the way they teach things. Yes.
Who headed the Orthodox branch? You mentioned the Orthodox very briefly. Who was the head of that, and in what city?
Okay, so that was also in Berlin. And the story of academic studies among Orthodox Jews is a very complicated story. Who was associated with the neo-Orthodoxy in Germany?
Hirsch.
Right. So Hirsch was the most dominant Jew who was associated with, but he was very anti-Jewish studies. He said in numerous occasions, it's better Judaism than science, or it's better that you're a Jew than you're a scholar, in all sorts of forms and shapes. He formulated this approach. So he was anti these institutions. But there was another rabbi whose name was Azriel Hildesheimer, and he established this institution in Berlin. And later on, David Zvi Hoffman was there. If you heard of Jacob Yechiel Weinberg, also a very important rabbi. So all these rabbis were teachers in that institution. Here you see here. So these are the seals of all sorts of books. When you see these books, it makes you, yes.
So just so I understand, so this is the beginning of, like before this, if you were becoming a rabbi, you got smicha, you got it from your local person. This is the beginning of the institutionalization of clergy, and also, I suppose, the centralization of study and the standardization in some ways of a curriculum.
Exactly.
And just out of curiosity, the Sphinx, what is, and any... Is that it's just a funny thing to have on this field?
I don't know what's the story of this. It could be somebody that stamped it later on. A lot of these books start in a Jewish library and end up in all sorts of other institutions, especially post-World War II. So very often you would have different layers of these seals on each book. But that's your homework. Try to find out for us the story of each one of these. It could be an amazing story. Sometimes you see 10 of those in one book, and you can actually trace how the book travels throughout Europe. These can tell a lot about these books. These are some pictures of the actual institutions. So this is the seminary in Breslau. This is the Hochschule in Berlin, and this is a modern picture of the Hochschule in Berlin. And this is the I'm sorry. And this is the Rabbinical Seminary in Berlin, the Orthodox institution in Berlin, a picture from before the war.
Another question. Are you going to get into the academic study of Jewish music?
Unfortunately, not so much. We have so many things to talk about. I'm already...
All right.
But you should know that Leopold Zunz had something to do with that as well. but not music per se, but he was involved in poetry, the synagogue, and everything that went on in the synagogue. So he was very close to this field, but not music, notes, and things like that. That's a whole different field. I'm not familiar with that enough. Okay, so this is a little bit about the institutions, and we need to start moving fast, but we're okay with time. Don't worry. Sarah, I'm okay. So the next thing I want to show you is a little bit we spoke about the inspiration and we spoke about the institutions, and now I want to finalize our discussion and talk a little bit about the ways that Jewish studies were circulating. And in some ways, it's fascinating that the variety of texts in which people spread their critical insights about Judaism, in many ways I would say there's so many forms and shapes. It's not just, critical books or journals, but you find these critical insights all over in all sorts of genres or in different types of literary compositions. So I want to give you just a sense, how did Jews circulate their ideas? The books that you will see here now are mainly in Hebrew and German, but you should know, because these were the main two languages in which this is circulating. Here and there, you can find also stuff in Italian or in French, but not the languages you need to know if you want to be a professional in Wissenschaft, Judentums, or in modern Jewish studies in Germany, is Hebrew and German. Those are the crucial two languages. So I'll give you here just a sense. So obviously, the most where we would expect people to circulate their ideas are books. Here you have 3 books that I talk about, devoted to the study of the Mishnah. We'll talk about all of these books later on in the course of this series. So now I'm just letting you get a glimpse of these books. The first one, can anybody recognize who wrote this book? Is anybody able to read these Gothic letters?
Geiger.
Abraham Geiger, right. This is Abraham Geiger's book on the Mishnah. It's called Leze Stücke, or a collection of a reader, aus der Mishnah, a reader from the Mishnah, a very important piece that he wrote on the Mishnah. So this is just one piece that Geiger put. Geiger is an amazing guy in the sense of how much he accomplished in his lifetime. This is his second book. The first book he wrote was a book about Judaism and Islam. He's really a brilliant scholar. This is just one book of his. The second book is by Zcharia Frankel. So the first one was by a Reform rabbi. This is by Zcharia Frankel. And the last one is by a less known scholar, but although also important, Abraham Khohmat. Maybe you heard of his father, Nachman Khohmat, also a very important scholar. Hanak, that was his acronym. So excellent. So that's his son. He wasn't so happy with that son, I have to say. But Nachman, the father, was not so pleased with his son because he was way more liberal than he would be. But it's also an important scholar. So this is the obvious. Also, journals are more obvious, or periodicals. Here we have maybe 30, 40 periodicals that appeared in the course of the 18th or 19th century, all devoted to modern Jewish studies. The first Jewish Hebrew journal, not just devoted to Jewish studies, is called HaMe'asef. Did anybody hear about this? This is from Mendelssohn's time. It appears already in Königsberg and in Berlin in the end of the 18th century. It's the earliest journal that ever appeared among Jews. So this is HaMe'asef. Here you already get some critical articles on biblical stuff or on rabbinic. And the other two are much more famous, but not the earlier ones. One of them is called Kerem Chemed. Again, it's a journal. It's a collection of letters, but actually more precise, it's actually articles put by leading scholars. And the final one is Kochvei Yitzchak. These are just 3 samples of many, many. There were so many periodicals that appeared in the course of the 19th century. It's a whole, you can spend your whole life just reading these articles. Not anything, sometimes you feel that what we have today is not even as many as what they had. It's such a rich world that people are just not familiar with, partly because we don't read German, so we don't have access to all of this, and partly because people are just not familiar with all of this literature. Very often, I could tell you that I read stuff that scholars put today, and from my very limited knowledge of 19th century scholarship, I see that people already said similar ideas 100 years ago or 150 years ago, and people are just not familiar with that. So this is a little bit about periodicals. That's the obvious. Now we're going to talk about things that are less obvious. People would talk or introduce some of their critical insights about Judaism also in the form of plays or in the form of poetry, novels. So you would write a novel, and in the novel, you will also introduce some of your critical ideas. Sometimes I regret that people don't do this today, right? Wouldn't that be fascinating? Instead of reading a long, boring textbook, you read a novel, and in the course of the story, you suddenly hear all these ideas that they have. So this is poetry. Meir Halevi Letteris, a very important Galician Jew. In the middle part, you have a guy who used to write, how do you say, satire? How do you pronounce this in English? In Hebrew, you say satira. In English?
Satire.
Satire. And the last one is a play. Somebody who put a play in, this is from 1805, on Rabbi Judah the Prince. A full play. It's just a fascinating text. Would you imagine that somebody would write a play on Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, and Rabbi Judah the Prince, the editor of the Mishnah? It's just amazing. Why did my professors in school not ask me to write plays on the themes instead of writing these boring seminar papers? So these are plays, novels, poetry. In scholars' sermons that they carried in their synagogues, very often you find critical ideas. Shlomo Yudah Cohen Rappaport, Judah Solomon Rappaport, a very famous chief rabbi of Prague, of the city of Prague, and at least in his later years of his life, he puts it in the form of a book, his speeches, Rosh Divrei Shir, these were his initials, and again, a lot of scholarly work you can find there. Autobiographies, memoirs, in all of these forms, people deliver or expose what they think about different realms of Jewish studies. Again, it's not an academic publication, but nevertheless, you find a lot. The earliest Jewish autobiography, modern autobiography, was put by Solomon Maimon. You might have heard about him in German, but also other Jews. They put autobiographies, and in their autobiographies, they introduce some of their critical innovations.
We have a question in the chat.
Yes, we have to finish soon. Yes. Question.
Yes, we've got about 5 minutes left, but I want to read you a question from the chat.
Yes. I'm sorry.
It is just, Lizzie asks, is it just a coincidence that you have brought examples that deal with the Mishnah, or was Mishnaic literature of particular interest to these early scholars?
It's not a coincidence, but not because it was only for Jewish scholars, because I love studying the Mishnah in the 19th century. But I will also bring other examples in the course. Starting next week, we're not going to talk about the scholars and about this setting, but we'll actually read some of their ideas, and you will see that it's not just about the Mishnah. I love these texts. That's why, and I wanted to show you that same scholars could address the same theme from different directions. Here you find correspondence. People write or publish their correspondence in which it's not like your emails. I'm suspecting you. Maybe your emails are full of chidushim or innovations in Jewish studies, but these people, just their daily correspondence are full of revolutionary ideas. And I want to conclude our discussion and say something about the way that Jewish studies was perceived in the remaining once this movement is sealed by World War II. You all heard of Gershom Scholem, of course, the Kabbalah scholar. But in addition to studying Kabbalah, he published a very famous statement about Wissenschaft des Judentums in the year 1950, shortly after the war. And in that text, again, a very, very famous analysis of modern Jewish studies in Germany in the 19th century, he mocks these Jewish scholars. He says very nasty things about these people. He says, for instance, that all they were doing, this is the famous quote that everybody likes to quote him for saying, they were basically providing decent burial for Jewish studies. He talks about their books as graves. And he says all they were trying to do, this is just one, I'm sure it's translated to English somewhere. I couldn't put my hand on this translation, but you can see he talks about
Fear.
Why did he mock these Jewish scholars so much? So in the passage we read from Leopold Zunz, we might get some answer to that, because you remember how Leopold Zunz was referring to Jewish studies in the text we read before. He was almost saying there will be no more Jewish studies in 100 years from now. We just need to summarize everything before it gets lost. So some people influenced by Sholem thought that this whole huge project of modern Jewish studies was actually not rooted in positive positive motivations, but rather it comes from something very negative, an attempt to bury Jewish life and Jewish culture before it disappears. That was Gershom Scholem's approach. For many years, for 2-3 decades, people were very influenced by this approach, but nowadays people think it's exactly the opposite. That's what I think, and that's what many other scholars would say. It's actually exactly the opposite. Jewish studies was not meant to bury Judaism or to get rid of Judaism. In many ways, through Jewish studies, people kept their connection to Judaism. When people become more modern, more involved in critical world, I think they felt obligated. They can't abandon their Jewish life. They wanted to think of their Judaism in such terms as well. So instead of mocking them for trying to summarize everything and to get rid of Judaism, I think that was the way that they connected to Judaism. Just think about people nowadays. Many people, the way they can feel they can communicate with this if they don't practice this is very often by studying it, by turning it into a field of study. So it was not the way they got rid of Judaism, it was not their bill of divorce from Judaism, but rather the way that they maintained their connection with Judaism. It's a big topic, a lot of literature on that as well. And I think we need to conclude our discussion now, right? What time is it?
2 minutes.
Okay, so I have 1 minute on my clock. Any other, here, you have, I'll show you one more slide here. So this is, if you want, again, endless literature. This is somebody who wrote on Gershom Scholem's critical approach to a Wissenschaft is Judentum. And again, there's endless literature on this. If you want to look on the web, you will find a lot if you're interested in this. And how do people perceive this phenomena later on? Next week, we're going to stop talking about modern Jewish studies, and we're going to actually do some examples from different fields of Jewish studies. We'll talk about the conception of oral law and the variety of texts that were studied, the context, and so on. So each one of these themes will have at least one session devoted to each one of the themes you see on this slide. Okay, questions? Sarah, I'm on time now. Exactly 9.
Perfect, perfect.
I'm waiting to see you next week. It's great to see you.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you everyone for joining today. I do want to give a quick plug that Drisha's fall programming will continue tonight at 8 p.m. with the second part of a series by Rabbi David Silber on imagining King David in the Babylonian Talmud. And in addition to this and the King David class, there are many more classes happening right now. You can always find out more information and find the registration links on our website at www.drisha.org/classes. So again, thank you everyone for joining, and I will see you next week.